the Arlington Diocese, and I'm delighted to be with you. And I really want to commend you. I don't know if you're all William's age, but if you are, on a Saturday night to be gathering to talk about this topic is really, for me, very, very affirming and inspiring. It's important, and really, in a very concrete and practical way, I think the insights of the church with regard to the social question, the broader social question. I'm going to talk a bit about economics, but there's a broader social question than just economics, even though economics permeates the social question. This really is the key to all of the confusion that's going on in our society right now with regard to the political debates. So let me start by telling you why I came to these ideas so many years ago. I grew up in Brooklyn, as William mentioned. It wasn't an Italian neighborhood, actually. It was a very mixed neighborhood. It was like everything, Jewish and Irish and Italian and Puerto Rican and Black and Chinese. And, you know, I mean, Brooklyn, predominantly probably Jewish and Italian at the time that I grew up there. And we grew up in a small apartment above it was called Coney Island Avenue, which is not Coney Island, the beach, but it's about 2 or 3 miles from the beach. It was a very busy, you know, if you think of a congested inner city, that's the environment. And it was a small apartment with 6 of us living in it. And across the way was another apartment identical to ours, but in that apartment lived Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. And I remember one day looking out my window. We were separated by what was in effect an access, a roof access. You could go out and then go up to the roof, but you could also go out the window and go across to the neighbor. And so we would very often borrow things from the neighbors. And I would watch Mrs. Schneider. I'm probably about 5 years old with this memory. And I'd watch Mrs. Schneider making some pastry. They're called rucola. It's an Eastern European pastry, and it's flaky, and it has walnuts and raisins and cinnamon and sugar and cream cheese, and it's just delicious. And she was baking it one day as I'm standing at my window, just peering over my windowsill, watching her and hers. It was a spring day, and she rolled out the dough and then put the ingredients into the dough and rolled them into crescents and put them in the oven, and then would take them out and do this over and over again. And she never looked at me until the last tray came out of her oven, and she put it on the windowsill, and then she looked at me directly and she said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." And so I scampered over my windowsill. I went up to her windowsill, held out my greedy little hands, and she placed a napkin over them. And the warmth of those pastries and the smell, the aroma, it transfixed me. But I noticed as she placed these rucola on the napkin, there were a series of blue tattooed numbers that went up her forearm. And I didn't understand what that meant. I took the pastry and brought them into my house and hid them from my siblings. And when my mom came in, I said, Mrs. Schneider gave me these pastries. And I said, but why does she have, my memory of it is that I was whispering. I don't know why I would be whispering, but my memory of it is that, why would she have numbers on her forearm? And it was then that my mother gave me the most profound lesson in philosophy, morality, ethics, anthropology, politics, the whole thing, in this one little thing that we went back and forth that she said, you know, when you watch the television shows with the cowboys and Indians, and the cowboys will lasso the calves. And I said, yeah. She said, what do they do with the calves? And I said, well, they brand them. And she said, why do they brand them? I said, well, so that all the other cowboys know who owns the calf. She said, that's what some people did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider, just because they were Jews. And they came to our country for safety. You know, right there, my visceral reaction to this was horror, to think that somebody as nice as Mrs. Schneider would be treated that way. And they had lost their whole family in the Holocaust. And right there, I began to see the social question. You know, at 5 years old, I couldn't have called it that. I didn't know what all that meant, but there was something iconic, something, you know, a parable communicates to us so much information in a story. And it takes us a while to unpack the story. And it's taken me all of these years to unpack that story. And what did that story have to do with? As I've learned now, having been in theology and studied economics, that really tells us first and fundamentally about the dignity of the human person. And I want to tell you that that is the foundation of all of Catholic social teaching, that what we're about in engaging this question of economy or politics or ethics or culture has to do with the dignity of the human person, because we believe that the human person is created in the image and the likeness of Almighty God, that we have inscribed on our hearts eternity, that none of us is the sum total of our physicality. We're not just the sum total of the dust of the earth, to use the words from the book of Genesis. We're not the sum total of our physical parts. We transcend our physicality, but our physicality is part of who we are. So we can't ignore it and make believe we're just angels floating around. We're physical and spiritual together at the same time. That's the definition of the human person. That's what it means. We're not just angels who kind of inhabit bodies temporarily. Remember, in the Apostles' Creed, we say that we believe in the resurrection of the body. The body is we say there's a 50-cent word, constitutive part of who we are. That is, it makes up part of who we are as human beings. And even when we're separated from our bodies temporarily by death, there will be an ultimate rejoining of our body to our soul in the end. So this becomes very important. I know this may sound terribly theological and impractical or abstract, but this brings us to the question immediately of economics, because economics becomes an important point of study because of the reality of scarcity. We're placed in a world where time is scarce, where resources are scarce, where our space is scarce. There's just so much of it. And how do we make our way through this world of scarcity? That's what gives rise to economics. Economics is basically the prudential use and the search for, the study of the use of scarce resources. If we didn't have scarcity, we wouldn't worry about prices. If we didn't have scarcity, we wouldn't worry about markets. But we do have scarcity because we are physical and spiritual. And when I think of Mrs. Schneider and what happened in Europe at that time in human history, boy, that has everything to do with human dignity, which bumps up against this question of economics and politics and the role of government and everything associated with that. And that forms the basis, or at least the catalog, if you will, of the issues that the church is interested in, because the church is interested in the human person. From the moment of our existence, from the first moment of our existence at our conception, and all through the rest of our lives. And for me, this became, very important, both because Mrs. Schneider was a reality to me. Everything I thought about after that, when I would think about the social question, would be seen through the lens of that. You know, it's you've heard the phrase, some things, once you see them, you can't unsee them. That was it. I can't unsee the reality of Mrs. Schneider, and in her, I see the reality of human vulnerability, of human dignity, of human rights. And for much of my youth, that is to say in my 20s, I was away from the church and fascinated by the political systems that were making claims to a just society. For me, you know, I'm an old man now. This was the 70s. This was the anti-war movement, the advent of socialism, new socialism, what we call the new left. And you can all think this right now, this is ancient history, but you're going to be living through this, because right now, at least those of you who are in the United States, those of you who are outside the United States are probably already living through it. But this whole claim of socialism to social justice, even in the name of the church, we have to confront some of these questions and unpack the meaning of them. And I'm going to talk for a little bit more, but I hope we'll have a chance to engage questions to kind of get to what interests you and what things maybe bother you or are not clear for all of you. I was involved in the political left in the 1970s. At that time, even though I grew up in New York, I was living in California by the time I got to my 20s. And if there was a picket line, I was picketing. You know, I was involved in all these demonstrations. And as I say, away from my faith. And finally, after a few years of this, somebody confronted me and asked me to read some books. And I read some books on economics, not even on theology, just on economics. And as I read these books, these were secular books about questions of socialism, questions of the right to private property. And as I read these books, a whole vision appeared before me that really reminded me of what I had learned in catechism class. In my day, we learned catechism from the Baltimore Catechism, which is a very simple question and answer format. You know, who made me? God made me. Who is God? God is the infinite being, perfect, who made all things and keeps them in existence. Why did God make me? God made me to love him, to serve him, and to be with him forever in this world and in the next. I have given talks in all kinds of audiences, and when I say that in a general group, people from my generation will be able to answer those questions like that. They had that drilled into their heads. And as I had it drilled into my head when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, years later in my 20s, when I began to look at these questions of social justice and socialism, my reference point was the Baltimore Catechism with these fundamental ideas of human dignity. And what I realized was what I memorized, merely memorized, I could now think of as an adult, and it just unfolded like a flower for me. And to make a very long story short, I realized that the socialist ideas were well-intended, but mistaken. And the reason for that, and this is really elaborated on in the encyclical by St. John Paul II, in his encyclical written in the year 1989, 1990, the encyclical was called Centesimus Annus, the 100th anniversary of the 100th year. I'll tell you what it was the 100th year of in a moment. But in that encyclical, he said the error, remember this is a pope who grew up under communism, under Nazism first, and then under communism. So he knew what he was talking about. You know, this wasn't something he just read in a book. He saw it in 3 dimensions. And he said the essential error of socialism was anthropological, by which he meant who is the human person. And if you understand the human person as a being that is both physical and transcendent, that lives in scarcity but is called to eternity, you begin to understand the question a little better. Socialism, of course, really, at least Marxist versions of socialism, assert that people are just material. It's called materialism, dialectical materialism, according to Marx. And that encyclical was written, and it's important for you to know this because Catholic social teaching, at least modern Catholic social teaching, goes way back to Pope Leo XIII's encyclical letter on the new things, or what is called in Latin Rerum Novarum, which is written at the end of or at the beginning really of the Industrial Revolution. And he is trying to introduce concepts of private property and the freedom of trade and the dignity of the worker. And then John Paul, 100 years later, in effect, rewrites or revisits Catholic social teaching. So all of this created a real reconversion for me. It's interesting that it was secular economics that reintroduced me to my Catholic faith. And so it was in my 20s that I returned to the church. I had been away from the church for 13 years, and I went to confession. I remember when I went to confession, it was a priest was visiting me, and he just wanted to see Los Angeles. But somebody had introduced me or introduced him to me, and he came over and he said, well, you're going to show me LA. I said, sure. I said, but Father, before we go out, I said, could you hear my confession? He looked at me. He didn't even know I was a Catholic. I mean, he knew my name was Italian, but he said, well, and he looked at his watch and he said, yeah, I guess so, because he wanted to go to dinner. And I said, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 13 years since my last confession. I just saw his eyes light up thinking, we're going to be here all night. I went to confession and he gave me absolution. And then I went back to the sacraments. And little by little, I was reconverted to my faith and then studied these ideas more systematically, more academically, and began the Acton Institute. You see the title behind me. I invite you to go to it, acton.org. You're going to find a wealth of information there. If anything that I'm saying is of mild interest to you, you're going to see the articles, the books, the films, especially look at the films that we have, different documentaries and things, and a very active blog site and a lot of debates. So what do I want to say? I want to say that socialism is a mistake because it doesn't understand human beings. I don't think that capitalism, which is a word invented by Karl Marx, is sufficient to understand the human person because capitalism only talks about capital. It doesn't talk about the broader reality of who human beings are. So capital is important. What is capital, by the way? That's a technical economic term. Let's think of it this way. Property is the fish. Capital is the net. Property is what is produced, but the system and the infrastructure is the net. And that's what Marx wanted to destroy. Capital in the hands of private owners. But Leo XIII, in that encyclical I mentioned, Rerum Novarum, said that in point of fact, private property is sacred because human beings have produced it by engaging in the real world, engaging in economic productivity. Economic productivity is rooted in human nature because we draw out from the material world what we need to live. We transform resources into wealth. Wealth doesn't exist in nature. Wealth only exists once nature or natural resources have been transformed into things that people can use, that are valuable to people. That is the basis of the free economy. And the free economy needs a moral goal to direct it. In other words, profit isn't the end. Profit's a means to the end, but profit isn't evil in itself. Profit's evil only if the system that produces it or the goals or the intentions are evil. but making a profit in a business is a necessary thing. So let me kind of conclude all of this. I know it's like sitting and drinking from a fire hydrant, right? Let me conclude all of this by citing what Mother Teresa said, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, what she said in opposition to Marxism, in opposition to socialism. She said, we have no right to condemn the wealthy. She said, we do not believe in class struggle, class warfare. That's the Marxist notion, class warfare. We believe in class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich. That kind of encapsulates what Catholic social teaching is. And I know I've said a lot and I've left a lot unsaid, but if it's okay, William, I'll stop now and open it up for discussion. And if you don't talk, then I'll either go play with my dog, or I'll say some more provocative things to get you talking.
Thank you, Father Sirico, so much. First of all, thank you for being with us and for your talk. I got to meet you at the Young Americans for Freedom conference this past, the one on faith and freedom. I think it was this past fall. Yeah, I think it was this past fall.
Was.
Yes.
September, I think.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, every time I hear your conversion story and like how much you were involved in these movements and seeing like these old headlines of you in these kinds of like anti-war, anti-conservative, anti-capitalist movements, I'm always amazed at how far you've come. And I am too. It's very amazing. It's truly amazing. So yeah, again, thank you for being with us. And I'm sorry more people weren't able to join tonight, but hopefully people will get to see this talk on the YouTube that we'll post it in. So with that, I wanted to open the floor for questions. And Father Sirico, just keep in mind for questions, not everyone here is a capitalist. This doesn't mean none of us are to the left of capitalism. None of us are socialist or communist or anything like that, which is a step up. But many of us, I guess, have some concerns about, concerns about what economies like this could lead to. So just keep that in mind when answering questions.
Sure, and you know, by the way, let me say, and I didn't include this, and I should have included this in my opening remarks, and that is the Catholic social teaching allows for a wide range of prudential discussion. You know, should there be a minimum wage? Should there not be a minimum wage? I mean, there's a lot. There is no one Catholic policy. The Catholic Church is not a system that teaches dogmatically economics. These are my reflections from what I see works well, but I hope we can engage in a conversation that's respectful, even if we disagree with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first question is from Jakob, who unfortunately had to leave, so you couldn't converse with him. But he told me to ask, what do you think about taxing the rich, and whether the government has the right and responsibility to tax the rich for the common good of society?
Well, let me introduce the concept of subsidiarity. This is part of Catholic social teaching. What subsidiarity says, and it's a principle, okay? So in order to apply it, you have to use prudence, and people will come to different conclusions about this. The first thing I want to say is I do believe in a government, right? I believe that taxation can be legitimate and taxation can be illegitimate. And that depends on whether or not we understand what the government exists for. And the principle of subsidiarity says that when needs exist in a society, they should be met at the most local level that they exist. So if I have a need, the first responders need to be my family or my extended family or the people who know me best, because then they're going to know what my needs really are. And that can be a parish, it can be an extended group of people, like a social service organization of some kind or another. And subsidiarity says we should not go to the next higher level of social organization until we've exhausted this first. So in other words, the city shouldn't come in and take the place of the family. The family should be the first responders. But sometimes the family is collapsed, especially now more and more in these days, by the way, I think, because of the interventions of the state, but we can have a prudential debate about that. But so we allow interventions at higher and higher, from higher and higher levels to the lower levels. But what St. John Paul II says in Centesimus Annus is that these interventions should only come in the case of emergency, and they should be temporaries. They shouldn't be substitutes for the natural society, for the business society, for mediating institutions. So in that regard, I think there's a certain level of taxation that we can ask for. But if you think the solution to solving poverty is just to take all of the money away from the rich and give it to all of the poor, I suggest you have a narrow view of economics. Because if, for instance, we took all of the money of all of the world, I don't know how many trillions of dollars that I did a kind of speculative thing in the book I wrote, Defending the Free Market. And I came to it's something like $7,000 or $8,000 per person in the world. If you did that and redistributed it to everybody, some people would be much poorer than they are right now, and other people would be incredibly wealthier than they are right now. But the question you have to ask is, what happens the next day? Where are people going to go and work? Because if you really do redistribute the majority of the wealth of the world, what you've done is destroyed the capital of the world. That is, all of the nets, the productive sectors, the means of production. And if you do that, people don't have any place to go and work. They may be wealthy for a few days, but they're going to have to trade with one another. They're going to have to build businesses again. So I think we should have levels of taxation that are not disincentives to the creation of wealth. I think if you look historically over the last 200 years, we've seen an incredible rise of the human population out of poverty. Prior to roughly 250 years ago, people lived basically at the same level of subsistence that they had always lived at. There were a few exceptions. There were some very wealthy aristocrats or thieves, or, but generally speaking, most of humanity lived at a certain level until about 200 years ago, when we see this level rising. And it's really incredible. If you go to the last 70 years, that goes up like a hockey puck, like a hockey stick. You just see this. And what happened about 200 years ago that began this incremental rise? It was the globalization of markets, that is business, not even charity. Charity is not the normative way in which poor people rise out of poverty. The normative way in which poor people rise out of poverty is by having jobs, that is, engaging in the market economy. Charity exists for emergency circumstances, should be temporary. It shouldn't be seen as the be all and all. This is the problem. Socialism. Socialism conceives that there is just one limited zero-sum pie, and that you need to divide it up. So you tax the rich for the poor. But the fallacy there is that the pie, the wealth, isn't static, it's dynamic. So if you create more jobs, if you allow people to create more jobs, you're going to have more wealth, and there will be a gap between the rich and the poor. But if the gap is between Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, I mean, Bill Gates is much wealthier than Warren Buffett. Um, for some reason, that doesn't create sympathy in my heart. Poor Warren isn't as, so the gap isn't the question. And the ceiling isn't the question. I don't care if Bezos or Musk are thousands of times wealthier than Bill Gates or than me. What I care about, I think what the gospel cares about, is the poor. How are the poor faring? And when we ask that question from an economic point of view, and it is economic, right, if you're talking about poverty, what you find is that it is not true that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That is not true from a demographic point of view, from an economic study. What is true is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting richer. It's just that when the rich are richer by 20%, that's a whole lot of money. When the poor are richer by 20%, it's not as much as the rich, but it's 20% more than they had before. And that's what's happening almost in every economy throughout the world over the last 30 or 40 years, except communist countries, North Korea, except Venezuela, except Cuba.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is from Trey, and Trey asks, what is your take on Canadian government and economic structure?
Well, I think it's better than Venezuela. I think that a lot of it, I mean, Canada is essentially a market economy. I think that in certain areas of it, they have greater levels of taxation. I think their healthcare system is not all that it's cracked up to be. I know Canadians love that, but I know the Canadians that live near the American border, when they really need medical care quickly, they go down to Detroit. And this I know from a personal experience. And I lived in England for years, so I know a little bit about living under a similar kind of medical system, state-run medical system. I think it's a mistake. I think, if you go into any grocery store and you go to the meat section, for instance, you're going to find different qualities of meat. If you go into a grocery store where all of the meat, there's no price tag on it. Well, I'm going to buy filet mignon, or Chateaubriand. I'm not going to buy chop chuck. I'm going to buy the best stuff there because I don't have any way to gauge the scarcity of it or my own needs versus the availability of it. When you socialize healthcare, that's precisely what you're doing. You're dumbing down people's ability to make decisions so that if every time somebody has a cold, socialized medicine is the emergency room. It's enormously expensive to go to an emergency room. If you have to pay to go to an emergency room, you're going to think twice about going to an emergency room. If you need the emergency room, then it should be there and you need to use it. I think, by the way, the pandemic is a very good example of all of this because what happened was, first of all, even before the pandemic, we have created huge international systems of health research and funding and regulatory agencies that required. In order to achieve the vaccine, we had to cut back on the regulations. We had to cut back on the things that impeded people from serving other people. I'm thinking about licensing for doctors and nurses, the production of masks and hand sanitizers, all of that. They had to reduce all of those regulations in order for the market to kick in. Even the production of drugs did that, so that the market produced the solution, the vaccines. So I think socialized medicine, as an example, of the Canadian versus the American system is very dangerous. And I'm sorry to say that I think there's a great fascination with all of that here in the United States right now. And I think that's precarious. Having said all of that, I like Canada, especially the Shakespeare Festival that goes on in Stratford, just above London in Canada. Canadians are much nicer than New Yorkers, I'll give you that.
Yes, yes. The only exception to that, at least in my personal experience, has been Vancouver. But from my heard, Vancouver
Well,
is not the best.
yes, that might be.
Yeah. All right. Gabriel asks, what are some things we should keep in mind when being approached or approaching economic practices in our lifetime?
Gee, I wish Gabriel, you'd say more about that. I mean, what we have to do is apply prudence. What is prudence? St. Thomas teaches us that prudence is the practical application of the truth to a situation. And it's very often that prudence is vague. So when you say, how do I apply these things to my economic life? I have to say, well, you start with a basic understanding of morality. Thou shalt not steal. Okay, that's private property. Transparency, honesty, ethics, understanding that just because you can do it doesn't mean that you ought to do it. I think a sense of generosity, but a sense of generosity that is prudent, because we can disable the poor in our well-intended generosity. I tend not to give money out on the street, at least not in the Western world, because I know that people have resources, generally speaking. I mean, if they're disabled in one way or another, then I want to help people. But even in the Western world, anyway, people who are disabled have sometimes more resources to draw from than other people. What I'm very cautious, and in our parish that I'm the pastor of, we have a very vibrant group of people that come to us, but we don't just give money out. We get to know the people, and we'd rather than giving them $5 or $10, we'd rather fix their car. We'd rather get them in a home, stabilize a whole family, enable them to go to work. I don't know when you say what decisions should I make on an economic level, whether you're talking about the charitable question or investing. Of course, we don't want to invest in anything that's intrinsically evil. We want to be smart in our investing, and I hope creative. I hope that in your economic life, you're very creative and not afraid to risk a bit so as to create for yourself, your family, and for other people.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great point. All right. The next question is, I think it's about, what do you think of, Nicholas asks, what do you think of liberation theology?
Well, it's amazing that folks your age know anything about liberation theology. I mean, part of what I cut my teeth on and was liberation theology. Let me say, for those of you who don't know what liberation theology was, it was largely a movement in the 1960s and 1970s, a little bit into the 1980s, that if I were to put the definition on a bumper sticker, which is never a wise thing to do, but I'll do it just for the sake of the conversation tonight. Liberation theology was an attempt to baptize Karl Marx. It was originally an attempt to take Marxist social analysis, these things that I'm talking about, class warfare, dependency, class struggle, the abolition of private property, things like that, and read all of that through a Christian vision of the human person. I think ultimately it was a confused idea. I think it didn't work out in the countries where it was attempted most exuberantly. I'm thinking of particularly Guatemala and now Venezuela. Cuba became fascinated with it, even though it pre-existed liberation theology. There was some interest on the part of Castro with liberation theology. I think also Colombia and Peru had some experiences of it. It was largely a Latin American phenomenon, and it was socialism with a Christian face, basically. Today, there are more sophisticated versions of it, and I think in a way, some of the environmentalist movement is enamored of it. I remember when I was in Nicaragua, which is one of the places it was really tried. In Nicaragua in the 1990s, there were people who were saying, well, we're going back to the United States to form movements of environmentalism because we think that's a better way to socialize the economy on a broader level. So I've written some things on liberation theology years ago, which are available on the Acton Institute website.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing this group does have in common is we all are more traditional in theology and liturgical preference. So I don't think any of us are fans of it here. And Nicholas is actually, he's Latin American. His last name is Diaz. And yeah, so I think he's just as much a fan of it as you are.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
My parish is interesting. You talk about liturgy. I know we're talking about social teaching tonight, but my parish is unique because we have a blend of, we do the traditional Mass, the Latin Mass, and we do the new Mass, but we do the Mass in a way that is in continuity with the old Mass. And the response has been really fascinating in our, in response to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to get caught up too much in the topic of liturgy, but if you
we
know
can talk about liturgy another time.
Yeah, if you know the parish St. John Cantius, they do the same thing. And their superior was on just like a few weeks ago to talk to us also.
Oh, great. Good to hear.
Chris asks, what are your thoughts on distributism? I haven't looked too much into it, but from what I hear, it sounds like a weird and interesting alternative to both communism and capitalism.
You know, this is a sophisticated group, I have to say. I've been in seminaries that haven't asked questions as sophisticated as this. Distributism is, let me define it first. I mean, it really popularized probably among our kinds of Catholics, Orthodox Catholics, by Chesterton and Belloc. I would say those were the two most prominent. In my reading of Belloc and Chesterton, I have to say, and I have friends who are distributists, I think the mistake of distributism is when they say it is the doctrine, the economic doctrine of the Catholic Church. If a person wants to be a distributist, I have no problem with that. I wouldn't accuse you of heresy the way I might accuse some liberation theologians of heresy, because some of them were really way out. Generally, distributists are Orthodox Catholics, but I think mistaken for this reason. The Catholic Church does not propose a third way, and that's what distributism, in fact, even in the question, you basically say it's a third way between capitalism and socialism, this kind of third way. John Paul II in his encyclical Centesimus Annus says Catholic social teaching is not a third way. It's a whole new way of doing economics. And the other thing I would say about distributism is that it's not economics. It's aesthetics. It says we don't like cheap goods. We don't like garish products. And frankly, I don't either, you know, but some people do. You know, my mother's aesthetic sense is a lot different than mine is. And aesthetics is a beautiful thing if you want to bring the cow to the table and put the milk directly into your tea. But that's not a sustainable economic system. And that's the problem with distributism. It wouldn't allow for globalized international businesses, which are utterly essential. If you're talking about 7 or 8 billion people on the planet, you have to have multinational corporations. It can't be just the little shop that produces handmade shoes. I mean, I like those things. Those are boutique operations. And occasionally you want to buy a sweater that's made by hand. But if we all had to live like that, the division of labor would destroy the ability to produce goods and services that would be available to more people at prices that they could pay. So I like the aesthetic of distributism, which is a boutique aesthetic, but I don't like the economics of it. That is, if you want to do it, but don't make it a law. Don't tell people, I was talking to somebody once who was essentially a distributist, and he was talking about our young people have begun building these little businesses. I forget what the particular business was in the basement of our church. And he said, we're supporting that. I said, yeah, you'll support that until they have another church and another church and another church basement where they're producing all these goods. And then they become a corporation. Then you're against it. At what point does it become evil? And I don't think the bigness of a thing equates with the evilness of it. I think you have to watch that. There's a lot more that can be said about that. And I have regard for somebody like Joseph Pierce, who's a friend. I consider him a friend of mine, who's written a book on that. But I think it's just sadly mistaken. I would much rather read his books on literature than on economics.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Chris, you were interested in that, then Acton has hosted a debate between Father Sirico that's mentioned, Joseph Pierce, who's a distributist, and Dr. Jay Richards, who is an employee at Catholic University. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I would definitely check that out.
We also have a little monograph on distributism too, which you can access on the Acton website.
Speaking of complex questions, Anonymous asks, in his economic thought before Adam Smith, Rothbard talks about the Spanish scholastics, such as people like Mariana and Suarez. How heavy, if any, did the Spanish scholastics play a role in the forming of your views on economics and the government?
Well, if you're asking the question here, how did they form my thinking? I have to say I only came to them after my thinking was formed. So, but they formed the whole school of thought that I learned from, that mainly the Austrian School of Economics. It's fascinating when I went back and read the scholastics. I think in a way embedded in that Baltimore Catechism, I don't mean in any of the questions of the Baltimore Catechism, but the way of thinking that was presented, the culture, the mentality of it, set me up for what I'm doing today. And the scholastics, of course, the scholastics are the inventors of modern scientific economics. And Joseph Schumpeter, who is one of the great Austrian economists, says that. He has a whole chapter in his book, History of Economic Analysis, that these scholastics were the precursors to modern economics before Adam Smith. When people say Adam Smith invented economics, he didn't. It was really the scholastics. And what's interesting about the scholastics, remember, is that they didn't have economics as a organized discipline. They were dealing with moral theology. And in their probing of the question of what is moral, they developed economic principles. So really, in a sense, modern economics emerges from Catholic moral reflection. I had to point that out to a Nobel laureate economist once when I gave a paper at a secular society of economists. And he got up and he said, Father Sirico, we enjoy having you with us. Welcome to our profession, but leave your theology at the door. And I said to him, I have a high regard for the contribution you've made to economics, but I think you forget one thing. that the inventors of economics are the scholastics. So I welcome you to our discipline, that kind of thing. So that, again, this is a very sophisticated question to be citing Rothbard and the Spanish scholastics.
Yes, thank you. The next question, Damien asks two different questions, completely unrelated to each other. First of all, he is considering joining the Jesuits, so he was just wondering, what are your thoughts on that, your experience with the Jesuits? And then secondly, when will the church update her teaching on usury? He's incredibly confused on what the current teaching is.
Well, let me answer the second question first. My colleague, Sam Gregg, has written a very good book that I think will really help to clarify the whole usury debate. The church, in effect, has updated her belief, her teachings on usury, and did it centuries ago, really. But it's obfuscated, and a lot of people want to keep it vague because if you see the update, you see how the church grappled with these questions, you understand that she's more disposed toward banking and interest than you might otherwise think. So Sam Gregg, look his, I think I've forgotten the name of the book. It's it has the word monetary in it. Look at his various books and get the description, you'll find it. So the first question was, what was that again? That was interesting.
Just your thoughts on the Jesuits in general. And
oh, the Jesuits, yes. I have to say, I have had probably 3 or 4 Jesuits who really helped to clarify my thinking on a lot of things: economics, politics, morality. I wouldn't give the Jesuits too much on liturgy. You know, they say there's nothing more lost than a Jesuit in Holy Week. You know, understanding how liturgy.
There's a
functions.
running
That's
joke.
Never been there.
There's a running joke that's been told that's what's the one thing that doesn't change at a Jesuit mass, and it's the bread and the wine.
Right. I hope that's not the truth. So let me make a distinction between the Jesuit tradition, St. Ignatius Loyola, and the modern state of the Jesuit order. Of course, the insights of St. Ignatius are attractive and should be attractive. They have produced a great number of heroic martyrs throughout the centuries. Their spiritual direction, their discipline, their fidelity to the Holy Father, all of this is a noble, venerable, admirable tradition. I just wish many of the modern Jesuits would follow that tradition. I think in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a lot of it went astray. By the way, you know, I said that I had been influenced by, there are old school Jesuits, what they call old school Jesuits. You know, then Father Avery Dulles was a professor of mine at Catholic University of America. We became good friends over the years. He concelebrated my first Mass. I wish I could pull off the wall here the picture of my first Mass with Avery Dulles. Dangerous at liturgy, by the way. You know, watch out, you could get hurt. But a holy man and one of the most honest intellect in the church, the formidable intellectual tradition of the Jesuits. Joe Fessio, the founder of Ignatius Press, is a friend of mine. Another priest, you wouldn't even know his name, but he was a professor at Father Schlatter, William Schlatter at the Gonzaga University. I had him in my earliest years of studying theology, and a number of others. Certainly throughout the war, Father James Schall was a friend of mine at Georgetown University, expert in politics. But I would say if you're going to go into the Jesuits, just be very explicit with them about their own fidelity to the history of their own order. that whether they really will embrace and not reinterpret the teachings of the church as outlined in the authoritative source of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In the brilliance of the Jesuits, I think there has been a lot of error. That is brilliance applied to wrong things. And I think that's very sad. And I think there needs to be a corrective, and someday there will be a corrective. And I hope it will come from within the Jesuit order. And maybe you're one of the ones who are going to be one of the people to call the Jesuits back to their original founding.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question is from Jakob. So Jakob, you can go ahead and unmute if you want.
Jakob's back?
Yes, Jakob is back.
Yes, I'm back now. Thank you, Father, so much for joining us. I just wanted to, I came back in just like a half hour ago. I had to sneak out to go pray a quick rosary with my family, but I'm back now, and I just wanted to ask you a quick question about something that's been in the news lately a lot, I think, on the issue of the stock market. I think a lot of our generation is now becoming a bit more involved, especially in the stock market, trying to figure out what this means for us, and especially with what's been going on with GameStop and some of these other very volatile stocks. And so, it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about that, whether there is a specifically, if there's a morality aspect when we go in and trade in the stock market. Is there something that we can do, something that we can't do, such as like shorting a stock? I don't know, shorting does have like a little bit of a morality issue, I've heard. And so I just want to hear, well, are there things which Catholics can do in a clear conscience and other things which we can't, or how exactly should we go about, working in the stock market?
It just seems like a habit of groups and sessions like this that you get the heaviest question right at the end, because we're just here at the hour mark, and I'm a great believer in observing time because that's what we agreed to do. So I'm just very honestly going to punt on the question because I'm not a finance guy. I'm an economics guy, which is different than finance. I can give you broad outlines. Thou shalt not steal. You have to be honest and stuff. You can't invest in things that are intrinsically evil. But let me make a suggestion to you. If you're interested in this question, William, invite a colleague of mine, a member of my parish, as a matter of fact, by the name of Eric Kovalak. He is a finance guy. He spent a year in seminary. He has a family now, and he's going to shoot me for recommending him. But you will be able to ask him about all that. He has a whole cryptocurrency hedge fund. He can talk about these things both in moral and in technical language. And so I want to punt on that and suggest that you have somebody on who really gets the complexity of these things. I from my own retirement and everything, have economic advisors because I don't fully grasp what's going on in the market and these kinds of things.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
I thank you for your honesty, and we will definitely reach out to your colleague there. And I just wanted to say thank you again. And I'll give you the opportunity now. I think it'd be nice if you could, give us just a few parting words, and also take time now to kind of, talk a little bit about a few of your own works and anything which you might suggest to us in terms of looking on the Acton Institute, or any other people which we should reach out to ask more questions on this topic.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to send you some suggestions of other people who you would find very interesting in various regards. Sam Gregg would be one of them. Eric Kovalak would be another. Michael Matheson Miller would be another person. We have, and if you want to engage some Protestants, we've got great people. The Acton Institute isn't a Catholic organization. It's an ecumenical organization. We could even, you might want to even have a Muslim on to talk about the free market and Islam. So I would urge you to go and poke around the Acton website. watch our video on called Poverty Cure. It's riveting and it's informative. It talks about how people rise out of poverty, or the entrepreneurial vocation. It's charming and interesting. And let me kind of sum it up by saying to you what I say to the students in my school. I'm here tonight because this kid, William, came up to me and said, I got this thing going and I'd like you to be here. You know, I this is an hour out of my life that I don't need taken out of my life. But when he described you, I think you, and I don't know all of you, but I can see it in William's face and I can hear it in Jakob, and these questions are astoundingly sophisticated. You guys are serious thinkers, and you're serious thinkers, and you're being formed in the fullness of the faith, so that it's not just academia for you. The fact, Jakob, that you came from a family rosary tells me a whole lot without even knowing you. And I think you guys are indispensable for the future of our world. You have to take your vocation so seriously. It's not just about piety. It's about applying your piety to your technique. Develop your technique, whether that's in finance, whether that's in the arts, whether that's in language, whether that's in a religious vocation. Take your piety and apply it to your technique, and respect your technique, because that's the way in which you will employ your piety. And what am I saying? I'm saying that you need to bring this formation that you're having now to the world that you're going to be involved in, because each and every one of you has a vocation. As Newman said, God wants to do something with you that he can't do with anybody else. He needs you, in a sense, to do this. And so, I take very seriously the time that you've put into tonight. I take very seriously each of your lives. And I promise you tonight, before I go to bed, I'm going to pray for you that God would create missionaries wherever you go, missionaries out of each one of you, even the guy who's interested in the Jesuits, so most especially him, because you need to bring that enthusiasm and clarity and fidelity to the tradition, your fidelity to the tradition of the church, to our world, which, if you haven't noticed, has gone insane.
Absolutely. Amen. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Father Sirico. Before you
you.
go, though, I know quite short on time. Will you give us your blessing?
Absolutely. Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus.
Amen.
Please pray for me. And if I may be very personal and intimate right now, I ask you to pray for my sister. She was like my mother, 13 years older than me. She was like a second mother. And she's dying tonight. And I'd really be very grateful if you pray for her to enter into eternity.